Well, we're continuing with our sermon series today about the pursuit or the goal of the search for happiness. We have this goal of happiness in our lives. We're in the pursuit or the search of happiness through much of our lives. And remember, we talked about this in light of our previous sermon series on covenants. The idea is that in a covenant you unify with something. The problem is that in that unity, a lot of those marriages, a lot of those unities, a lot of those covenants end up becoming unhappy covenants. And so we want to understand, well, how do you exist in these covenants and how do you find happiness in them? And today we're going to talk about giving. And giving is really at the heart of whether or not you're going to be happy in a covenant. If you can learn how to give covenantally, joyfully, you're going to experience a lot of joy in the covenants that you have. If you don't, you won't. This is really the heart of the issue here. Probably the most important thing that we'll say in this series on happiness. And really, this is at the heart of the Christian life. Now, whenever you talk about, I was talking about this in our Sunday school class this morning, whenever as a pastor you say, I'm going to speak on giving today, a lot of times people will say, oops, it's time for me to go. I'm not talking about, it's important to understand here, I'm not talking about your wallets today. I'm talking about your life. If you condense this down and all you hear is me talking about your wallet, you are missing the point. We're talking about the giving of your life. And in Matthew chapter 10, verse 39, it's the verse that we're going to be orienting ourselves around today. It says, whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. It's interesting that the Bible is full of these kinds of sayings and references. Jesus talks about it all the time. He talks about taking up your cross and following him, all that kind of stuff. And really, a lot of the parables end up revolving around this concept too. And yet, we find that in the church, we kind of are at a loss to explain this or understand it. How do you find your life and lose it? How do you lose your life for his sake and find it? How is that true? Well, as we look at this idea of giving and its relationship to happiness, we want to ask ourselves a few questions. The first one is giving just tyranny dressed up? Right? Now, when we talk about giving, are we just talking about some kind of tyrannical demand that's just dressed up and made to look happy? Is that what we're doing? I think you'll find that we're not. Number two, what is the benefit of giving? And number three, what happens if I don't give? These are the things that we want to discuss and explore today as we talk about this idea of giving, its relationship to happiness inside of covenants. Now, the problem is, as we look at question number one, is giving just tyranny dressed up? As we explore this first question, the problem that we have is that we come from a time in world history where looking out for number one has really become what is the accepted norm of our behavior. And it really has caused a lot of difficulty in relationships. In fact, if you look at how relationships are going in our current day and age, it's not very pretty. And I think about kind of growing up in the 70s and 80s and the commercials that I saw. And one of the things that you saw a lot in the 70s and 80s in the commercials that were on TV is, you can have it all. Do you guys remember that? You can have it all. And that was what products promised. That's what a lot of things promised, is you can have it all. There's no reason to compromise or give anything up. You can have it all. And this mantra of having it all has become something that our culture has oriented itself around in a very significant way. What's wrong with this idea of you can have it all? And in fact, if that's the way that we believe, if that's the way that we look at life as the desire and the pursuit of having it all, then the question or the demand or even the invitation to give looks like tyranny just dressed up. Because how can I give and have it all at the same time? You see, that's the problem that we run into. If I can have it all and I'm being asked to give some of it away or give some of it back, then I'm not having it all. And we see this as just tyranny, wearing different clothes. In the Bible, there's different kinds of giving, and all of them have a theme of sacrifice in them. In fact, the Bible speaks about this all the time. The Bible speaks about choosing between paths or outcomes, the narrow gate and the wide gate. Choose this day whom you will serve. The Bible speaks about these choices that we have to make all the time. The reality is, from the biblical perspective, you can't have it all. You actually have to make some choices in life. In fact, it's an illusion to think that you can have it all, because some things are contradictory with one another. And so to have one, by definition, means to not have another. So the Bible's perspective is, no, you can't have it all. You must choose. One of the things that you can't have all of is you can't serve every God that there is. The Bible makes that very clear. In fact, God demands it, saying that we are to have no other gods before Him. But in light of our culture, these demands of giving up things, choosing between paths or outcomes, seems to be tyrannical. Why can't I just have it all? There's a second form of giving that the Bible speaks about. One is choosing between paths or outcomes. The other one is the giving of self. The Bible speaks of this in many ways, at many times. It says, for instance, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. That's not necessarily choosing between a path or an outcome. That's saying that you have resources, you have things that are yours, and the Bible's call is that you are to give them up and give them over to God. The Old Testament was full of this kind of giving. There were many tithes in the sacrificial system, many things to be sacrificed, many times to tithe. In fact, I was looking at it. The interesting thing is when we talk about tithing, you guys have probably heard 10%, right? If you tithe, it's 10%. The problem is actually when you get into the nitty-gritty of the Old Testament system, there were several tithes and other times to give and sacrifices that had to be made. And when you take the whole system into account, some theologians estimate that up to 50% of a person's income was to be given to God. That's like taxes. So what's the difference between this and the tyranny of Egypt? Remember in Egypt that Israel, they were slaves. God had allowed them to go down to Egypt because of the famine, and they had existed there. Remember that Joseph was second in command of Egypt when his brothers came down, and there was a part of the land that they were given to settle in. But they grew prosperous and they grew numerous down there. And eventually the Egyptians decided they weren't so sure about having all these foreigners live there, and so they enslaved them. And if you recall, at the beginning of the book of Exodus, there is this problem that the Israelites are in bondage in Egypt, and God is hearing their cries and getting them out. And the question is, does God just play a trick on them, getting them out of one tyranny, inviting them into another? And the problem is that if you speak to non-Christians, and maybe you even harbor these doubts in your own mind, a lot of non-Christians will see that that's what Christianity is. That's the idea that they have in their mind, is that it's just one tyranny traded for another. What's the difference between this and Egypt? The Israelite might ask. You see this a lot of places, and this is the idea of covenants in our day and age. The problem is, because we have this idea, this foundational attitude that we're going to have it all, because that's the thing that we think we can get. That's the goal. I want to have it all, and if I can't have it all, somehow I'm being robbed, because that's our foundational attitude. Then we see any kind of covenant where we're asked to give as some kind of ripoff. You're seen as foolish to give too much to the company. You're seen as foolish. In fact, there's a lot of guys now that see it as foolish to enter into marriage. You're seen as foolish or a sucker to sign up to be in the army, to have to go off and fight for your country. Only fools or suckers do that. I was reading this week about Richard Bong. You probably have never heard of him. Kind of an unfortunate last name. Richard Bong was a guy who lived in World War II, and he was just a regular guy, but he really, when the war came around, he wanted to fly, and so that's the area that he got into, and he was trained and put into a P-38 and sent over to the Pacific when that part of the war was not going all that well for us. That gave him a lot of opportunities to fly missions, and so he did. And over again, he went up and he fought in his airplane and he came out victorious. In fact, at one point, he had 28 victories and other guys that were high up in the victory numbers kept getting shot down. And so the American government decided, well, we don't want this guy who's at the lead. He's kind of a national hero. We don't want him getting shot down and killed. So they brought him back to the United States to do a war bond drive, but he didn't really enjoy that. He wanted to get back to the men that he was fighting with. And so he went back. They allowed him to go back to the Pacific under the restriction that he would not go out and fly missions, but that he would be a gunnery instructor, teaching other guys how to shoot. The interesting thing about that is he considered himself a bad shot and actually took extra gunnery courses. But because they didn't want him getting shot down, but he wanted to go be with his men, they said, okay, you'll be the gunnery instructor even though you don't think you're very good at it, and we probably don't think you are either, but it keeps you out of the fight. Now, they gave him a caveat, and they said, here's the deal. You can go up with your students, and if you happen to get into a fight, obviously you can defend yourself, but that's it. That's the only thing that we want you doing. Of course, Richard Bong decided not to do that. In fact, he went up with his students all the time, and they were constantly getting in more air battles. It's said that he constantly, to keep himself out of trouble, gave credit for additional victories to the people he was with. Even still, he ended up getting 40 victories. This was all stuff he didn't need to do. In fact, the government didn't want him doing it, but he felt an obligation to the men that he was with and to his nation, and he said, I need to go up and put myself in harm's way because I know how to do this. Well, at the point he had reached 40 victories, they said, no, you're clearly not getting the message. We need to bring you home. And so when they brought him home, he said, I know what I'll do. I'll be a test pilot. And that's how he lost his life not too long after getting married. He did not survive the war, not because he got shot down, but because he was one of the few people qualified to test America's first jet fighter. And that's what he was doing when he lost his life. Now, the interesting thing is that there will be a lot of people who will say that he was a sucker for that. That the giving up of his life was just foolishness. Many will see it as the sign of tyranny. So what's the difference from a biblical perspective between tyranny and giving in a covenant? In Matthew 11, chapter 28 through 30, Jesus actually outlines this. And really, if you connect this with what we just did in taking of communion, you'll get the point. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 through 30, it says, Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your soul. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So what's the difference between a tyranny and what God is calling Israel to, what God calls us to, and what so many covenants require of us in our lives? Are we fools for entering into these relationships? Well, the Bible says no, we're not fools at all. You see, the difference between a tyranny and a covenant is in a tyranny, you give everything and the other person gives nothing. In a covenant, you give everything because the other person is giving everything. You see, the reason that God calls Israel to give is because God has given all of himself to Israel. And if Israel and him are to be unified, it requires both of them giving everything. You see, you're foolish if you give everything to somebody who's giving you nothing, but you're not foolish if you give everything to someone who is also giving you everything. It's interesting that Jesus, at the beginning of his ministry, has John the Baptist baptize him. It's a very strange thing because remember, John was offering baptism of repentance, a baptism for the forgiveness of sins, a baptism of a person saying, I repent of my sin. And Jesus comes and John sees him there, and John says, well, wait, I can't baptize you. And Jesus says something interesting. He says, this is to fulfill all righteousness. And there's a big debate about, well, what does that mean? Because righteousness means kind of right standing with the law. And so how is it that Jesus needed to be baptized in order to have right standing with the law? And some theologians will say, well, the high priest, he needed to be baptized before he entered his position. And so to be right with the law, that's what Jesus needed to do. But there's another meaning for the word righteousness, which is an interesting aspect to that word. You see, we usually give it a theological or doctrinal or legalistic bent, but there's also a relational aspect to the word righteousness. Really, what righteousness means is it means the actions that God takes to preserve the relationship. Isn't that interesting? That's not what we think of when we think of righteousness. We think of righteousness, okay, I'm going to stand right with the law. But there's another aspect to that word, which means what God does to preserve the relationship. And that actually changes our understanding of that word completely. Why is it that Jesus gets baptized? Well, he does get baptized because he's entering into priesthood. But he's also doing it, entering into priesthood, he's doing that to establish and to save and to preserve the relationship between us. What really happens when Jesus gets baptized is Jesus gets baptized into representing you. He gets baptized. That's what it means to be a priest. A priest represents you before God. He's getting baptized into you. He's getting baptized into representing you. He's giving himself on your behalf to stand before God and say, I will take responsibility for these people. I will stand for them. And so anything that they do, I now answer for. So what happens when you get baptized? Well, you get baptized into him. Why is it a smart thing to get baptized into him? Because he's been baptized into you. You see, Jesus gives everything of himself first. And then he says, enter into a covenant with me. Be unified with me. Give me everything. That idea is a strange one. But the second thing that we need to see in our exploration of this idea of losing your life and finding it is, what is the benefit of giving? What's the benefit of giving all of your life? We were talking today about how, in our Sunday school class, about this idea that this is a strange concept to people. Like if you go out in the world and you say, well, you need to give everything of yourself to God, that sounds very bizarre to them. Again, it sounds like tyranny to them. It sounds terrible. In fact, I would say that most people it's hard for them to think of anything that could be worse than giving everything in your life over to God. And they say, well, I'll become a religious nut then. I've become a weirdo. And then they see people like me and they think, well, there you go. So here's the thing. Like, if you're trying to explain to one of these people that you know, well, why is it smart? Think about it this way. We were talking about this in our Sunday school class. Do you want your life to be perfect? How many of you would like for your life, if you could choose, how many would you like your life to be perfect? Okay? In fact, we were talking about how the pursuit of perfection is such a big deal. The Olympics are going on right now, and these athletes have given over their entire lives to try to be perfect in one tiny sliver of life. You understand what I'm saying? Like somebody does the shot put, and you go, well, what's the shot put? Okay, you take a big metal ball, and you throw it as far as you can, and somebody says, I'm going to dedicate my life to being the best in the world at throwing this metal ball. And we go, hey, that's awesome. Go for it, man. Dedicate your life to this. We'll watch it on TV. We'll cheer for you. We'll put on these big games for you. We'll glorify you in all these ways because you are dedicating your life to perfection. Now, here's the thing. What if you could give all of your life to perfection? Would that be better? Rather than taking one small, narrow strip of your life, like throwing a big metal ball, what if you can make all of your life perfect? Well, man, that would be worth so much more. Do you understand that when you give your life to God, God is perfection? God is perfection. What you're doing is you're giving your life over to perfection. And our culture does something weird. It says, oh, you want to give your life over to throwing this big metal ball? That's amazing. And then it looks at us and says, you want to give your life over, your entire life over to perfection. That's so weird. No, it isn't weird. What's the benefit of giving? I don't know if you guys have been watching what's going on in South Africa. Anybody been kind of keeping up with that, watching that a little bit? They're having a lot of political unrest in South Africa. There was a guy who was president, and he was widely suspected of corruption. And then when they got him out of power, they wanted to prosecute him for that. He didn't really want to be prosecuted. And so his followers started a big kind of insurrection looting thing, and then other people joined in on it. And there's some amazing pictures and videos online where you can see like big distribution centers. Think about like an Amazon distribution center or a big grocery center with hundreds of thousands of square feet of warehouse space and maybe dozens, if not hundreds of tractor trailers around it. That's that size. And around that, imagine thousands and thousands, almost uncountable numbers of people who are going into that distribution center and taking whatever they want and leaving. Now, what's the cost of that? What happens? If you're standing there, you say, well, you can look out for number one, or you can give that up. Why wouldn't you want to just go in there and grab a hold of whatever you can? Why wouldn't you get what you could for yourself now? Because here's the thing that, if the police rolled up on that situation, it's not like if you're one of those people that's going in and out of that place and you're getting whatever you want. Imagine going down to the Amazon distribution center and getting whatever you wanted and just taking it home. Why wouldn't you do it? You understand that the police could not stop that many people, that our laws basically revolve around all of us voluntarily giving up these things. Like when you enter into the covenant of being part of our culture, part of our society, part of our nation, you're asked to give up a whole bunch of things. And one of them is that you won't walk into a distribution center and just take whatever you want. Why should you give that up? They can't stop all of us. Let's go, skip lunch with me, and let's go down and we'll raid Amazon together. They can't get us all. Well, they could probably get all of us. We would need to collect some people on the way, but we'll convince them. Why wouldn't we want to do that? The question might occur to you, well, what happens tomorrow? Right? You understand that in the pandemic, that whole toilet paper emergency that we had, you guys remember how fun that was? Imagine that applied to everything. Everything. Light bulbs, toilet cleaner, everything. Everything. Do you understand what's going to happen? All of these distribution networks, all these logistical nodes in the supply chain have been destroyed. How long is it going to be before those things work again? You see, the giving up of that personal desire to have at no cost is necessary for all of us to function. You see, you're being asked to give that up. You're being asked to give up the desires and just to take what you want. You're being asked to give that up so that you can live in a society where you can go down day after day and find what you need to survive. And here's the thing. You can look at that money that you hand over to Amazon. You can look at that money that you hand over to Target or to Fry's, and you can say, I'm getting ripped off. Why should I keep giving this? This is dumb. Giving is dumb. Or you can look at it and say, this is an investment that I'm making into this whole thing, this covenant that works to benefit all of us. Do you understand that we live in a way that the history of the world couldn't possibly imagine? We live better than kings did through the history of the world. Because all of us have decided to give, to contribute into this thing. You know, here's the thing I was thinking about. Every dollar that you give makes you more important to that node and gets you something back. Have you noticed that? How many of you have gone to the store to look for, I don't know, pants or shoes? And you have to be an old person like me to have experienced this. And you're looking for something that you used to get regularly, and now you go to the store, and they don't have that stuff anymore. I remember going to find I wanted a pair of somewhat plain athletic shoes, and I went to the store. This isn't so bad anymore. I can find them now. But for a while, every time I went to the store to find plain athletic shoes, all they had was stuff with all this neon color on it, right? And like an old man, I was like, these are dumb, right? Am I the only one that does this? Okay, I can't be. Now here's the thing, you do that, right? You can't find your favorite pants anymore. They're all so skinny and weird, and you can't find your shirt, and you get old, and that's what happens. Why does that happen that way? Because somebody else is putting more money into the system than you are. You see, what happens is you get old, and pretty soon, clothes don't matter to you anymore, and so you don't matter to them anymore. It's our own fault. We stopped buying clothes, and now they're like, okay, we're done with you, right? What I'm saying is, here's the thing. Imagine being Amazon's best customer. Imagine that. Imagine that you are the person who buys more from Amazon than anybody else in the entire world. You think, I'm already there. No, there are people who buy more than you do. If you're their number one customer, do you think that they might listen to what you say? Do you think it might matter to them what your preferences are? Do you think that the way that you spend money might affect the way that they stock things? Oh, of course it does. You see, that's what unity in a covenant is. You can look at that money as leverage, but that's actually the wrong way of looking at it. It's unity. You see, you give and they give. And the more that you give, the more that they're going to want to give because it's better for them. You see, there's a whole that's created. There's a new organism. There's a new entity that's created when you enter into a covenant. And what's good, the more that you put into that, the more that the other person's good depends on you. Do you understand what I'm saying? There's a unity, there's a new organism, a new unity that's created. And the more you contribute to that, the better off you are. The better off you are. I've talked to you about that psychologist that I heard one time say, you never win an argument with your spouse. You never win an argument with your spouse. Why? Because even when you win, you lose. It's like you never win an argument with yourself. Right? You might be able to inform your spouse, you might be able to educate your spouse, you might be able to show them a different way of looking at something, but if you go in there thinking, I'm going to win this argument with my spouse, you've lost already. What happens if you win every argument? You think, woo, this is good for me. I win every argument. No, it's terrible for you. Because you know why? Because now you're married to a loser. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that in a technical way. You're married to somebody who loses all the time. Do you think that that's going to make them feel good about themselves? What happens when you're married to somebody who always loses all the time? Do you understand that that's not doing you any good? You're burning down your own house. You're destroying your own life. What's the benefit of giving? Giving isn't tyranny, it's investment. If you're giving to the right thing, if you're equally yoked. You see, the reason that God, throughout all the Old Testament, is telling his people, don't sacrifice to idols, don't give yourself over to idols, don't worship idols, is because the idol can do nothing for you. The idol puts nothing in. The idol is tyranny. That's why living in Egypt was so bad. You were expected to put everything in, and Egypt gave nothing to you. You see, what really works is when you give to something that's also giving back to you. And that's why God says, give everything to me, because I am withholding nothing from you. I was thinking about Richard Bong and remembering a couple months ago when I talked about the tomb of the unknown soldier. Remember how we talked about how the tomb of the unknown soldier is always guarded? That the people who guard the tomb of the unknown soldier, their shifts are long, about 14 hours, because they spend 8 hours getting their uniforms ready. 8 hours. That's how long it takes them to get ready to go out and do their shift. 8 hours. Why? Because everything has to be perfect. Why? They call it keeping faith. Whoever's in that tomb of the unknown soldier, even though they're not known, they gave up their life for their country. They gave everything. And so to keep faith, the country has to give everything back. Otherwise, they're breaking faith. That's the way that a covenant works. And so guys like Richard Bong, you can say, well, our political class isn't worthy of that sacrifice. Fair enough, but our country's not our political class. You could say, well, they were foolish to give up everything when not everybody is. Well, that's true. Show me the country that's giving more. You see, the problem that we have here is an important one that all of us have to wrestle with. Ultimately, you have to give your life to something. And is there anything that gives more than God? God has given us everything, and he continues to put everything on the table. And the way that he asks us to give back is to enter into these covenants that exist throughout our life in the way that he prescribes, to the amount that he prescribes. That's how we give back to him. The Bible talks about something really amazing in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 4 through 7. It says, but God being rich in mercy. This is so great. God being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up with him, and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, so that in the coming ages he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace in kindness toward us in Christ Jesus. That passage talks about how Jesus is united to us. Jesus is united to us in such a way that he took all of our sin and he took that to the cross. He took our life, he took our sin, he took everything that was wrong with us, everything that was bad about us, everything that was rebellious toward God that was in us. He took all of that and he took it to the cross. And so when we unite with him, what happens is we unite with him by giving him everything that we have. And guess what? It's not great. And in return, we get everything that he has. I had a friend that when he was in his mid-30s, he was single, living the kind of bachelor life as far as, cooking and all that kind of stuff, meaning he had no skills. He went out every day. He went to church on Sunday, and they invited him to come back to the potluck, and he said, well, I don't have anything. And they're just like, just get anything and bring it back. So he went home, looked in his refrigerator, he had some bologna, put it between a couple pieces of bread, and he took it to the potluck. And he said this church was great because even though it was small, it was full of a bunch of old ladies who had been cooking their entire life and had achieved the pinnacle of skill. And he said before him was laid out a feast like you couldn't imagine. And so he put his little sandwich down there, and he got a plate, and he filled it up with the most amazing food he'd ever eaten. And when he was done, he went through again. And his sandwich was still there. And at the end of the potluck, a little old lady came up to him and said, "Here's your sandwich." Nobody had eaten it. How could they when everything else was so great? And he said that's how he felt about what his exchange was with Jesus. And I can't think of a better example. That's really what it is. God asks us to give everything, and what we give is something of such low value. In fact, it's really kind of negative value. And what we get in return is everything, all of the riches that Christ Jesus has. Everything that he has from the Father. Everything is what he gives us. So finally and very quickly, what happens if I don't give? Well, there's an interesting passage in Matthew chapter 6, verse 19. And in this passage it says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Now the interesting thing is we usually focus on the part of this that talks about where your treasure is, there is your heart. But there's another part of this that's really fascinating, and he's talking about there's a difference here. You can lay up your treasures on earth, or you can lay up your treasures in heaven. Here's the thing. You have a life. You're going to give it to something. Something. You can't do anything else. Well, maybe you can off yourself, jump off a bridge or something. But other than that, you have to give it, you have to invest it in something. Whether it's just going home every night and watching TV, you're investing your life, you're giving yourself to something. The question is, what is it? Is it something that fades and perishes, or is it something that's eternal and everlasting? Now, this becomes important for us because this is really the thing that's offered to everyone, is you're going to have to give your life. You're going to have to make an exchange. You have to invest in something. Will that something be something that invests in you and lasts forever, or will it be something that perishes, that fades, that spoils, that rots? I was listening to a guy on the internet that had gone through a bad divorce. And he spent his time, he was just done with people, he was done with our culture, he was done with society. And so he made a school bus into a camper, and he could work remotely, and he was just going to drive around and be in his camper and just be like, "I'm done with everybody." And that's the choice that you can make. But in the end, you will have invested every minute of your life into something. What will be there? When the bus breaks down, what will you have? When you're too old to keep going on the road, what will you have? What will you have at the end of your life when you're on your deathbed? What will have been the result of the investment that you made? You see, you can't get out of giving. You just can't. You have to give your life to something. Richard Bong, the pilot, gave his life for his country. And the country gave him the Medal of Honor and remembers him to this day. But there's something even better to give your life to. Because eventually this country will end. It will come to an end and nobody will remember it. But if you give your life to God, then you're giving your life to something that has no end, that is eternal. You're laying up a treasure that will last forever. I was reading this week about Johann Sebastian Bach, and it's interesting to read about him. He's obviously a well-known composer. What's fascinating to me is I was looking at the way that he dealt with so many constraints in his life. I don't think we kind of understand how many constraints he had. First of all, if you wanted a job back then, there weren't that many jobs for composers, and so you generally worked for a church. And so that's what he did, and so he was really restricted largely to church music for a lot of his career. And you could say, well, that's a lot of restriction, but man, The guy wrote so prolifically. He would take like keys and write something, a ditty or a church thing, whatever they called them. He would write one in every key. You can see how educated I am about music. He would write one in every single key. Why? Because that's what was in front of him. He had this constraint, but within that constraint, there was all of this room. And that's what you see in his life, is that there were so many constraints in his life, but within those constraints, he would use every part that he could find. I'm going to write one of these in every key. Why? Because all those keys are there. Why not? Why not? It's there. In the same way, man, that guy, he had 20 kids. 20 kids. He had 7 kids with his first wife, and she died unexpectedly. So he married another wife and had 13 kids. 10 of them survived into adulthood. See, that's the thing, is that there was this great constraint at the time that he was living, that child mortality rates were really high. So what did he do? He had as many kids as he possibly could, and he endured the tragedy of losing 10 of his kids before they reached adulthood. But he ended up having 10 kids that reached adulthood. Everywhere you look in his life, he took the constraints that he had, and he used everything within that. He gave everything that he could, and now he's remembered as one of the greatest composers that ever lived. New Testament and Old Testament heroes are still remembered. Why? Because they gave their life within the constraints that they had. You give yourself to something, and it either is going to rot and fade. And when it rots and fades, you're going to watch its destruction. You're going to watch the destruction of something you've given your whole life to, and that destruction will impoverish and embitter you. You see, that's the problem with investing in something that doesn't last forever, is you will watch it fade. You will watch it fall apart. You will watch it rot. This thing that you gave your life to, you will watch it come to an end. And when that happens, often you will die as a broken person, or you can give your life and invest it into something that never fades, like Bach, praising in almost all of his music the glory of God. You will never see that end. You will never go through its destruction. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 1 through 4, I'm just going to finish with this. It says, "If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory." If you set your mind, if you invest yourself in something that never ends and never fades, you will never watch its destruction. In fact, you will see it grow, you will see it blossom, you will see it become so much greater. 3 things that we need to do to apply this. One is believe that God is united to you. Believe that God has withheld nothing from you. And also believe that God asks the same from you for your glory. God doesn't ask for you to give everything to him so that he can take advantage of you. He asks you to give everything so that everything in your life can be glorified. Belong to God by giving all of yourself. That's really what it means. When we belong to something, it's because we've invested ourselves. We like to think it's because they've invested in us, but man, that's only half the equation. We have to invest ourselves and become a new person as your life grows in union with him. You will be transformed to the extent that you invest yourself with him. Understand that God has already given himself, and there is nothing greater that he could give. The question is, what will you do in response?
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to this church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.